introduce myself. My name is Sharon Jones, and I'm an elder in the United Methodist Church. I have been to this church before, primarily to the parsonage. For several years, my husband and I served on the Nicaragua Planning Committee, and so we came here a lot. I wanted to share that with you because I understand from Joe
Yes.
that last song was familiar to you.
Yes.
Yes.
Very. Two verses. Two verses.
Two verses usually.
In Spanish a lot.
Yes. It's harder to do in Spanish, but
Right.
I must admit. But
It was Sandy's favorite.
oh, okay. One of my favorites too. So, but that's not why I'm here today. So I'm here. Pat invited me to come and speak to you about justice for our neighbors. So I invite you to be in prayer with me for a few moments. Almighty God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in thy sight, O God, our rock and our redeemer. Amen. So I wanted to talk with you about justice for our neighbors. This is a United Methodist ministry that grew out of the United Methodist Committee on Relief, UMCOR. Many of you are probably familiar with UMCOR. They were seeing many refugees and immigrants as a result of the various flooding, earthquakes, other types of natural disasters, as well as human disasters that were occurring around our world. And they felt a need to form this ministry. So Justice for Our Neighbors provides legal services to immigrants in need of legal advice. We help people who have overstayed their visas in this country, people who are seeking a green card, people who have family that might sponsor them living in this country, people whose spouse or employer is abusing them because they don't have the right papers. That's a problem, common problem. We also help people who are seeking asylum in this country. Justice for Our Neighbors does not automatically believe that all immigrants should become citizens, nor should all people seeking asylum be given asylum, nor should all people with temporary protective status, TPS status, be given green cards. But we do believe that all immigrants are entitled to good legal defense and representation.
Amen.
Our immigration system is complicated, especially so for those who are trying to gain some kind of status to be in the country legally. Imagine trying to negotiate this system without legal representation. Many of the immigrants I have met have a deep faith in God, and when their lives were in jeopardy, they followed God's lead into a new land. Welcoming immigrants is part of the work of loving God's people, along with feeding the hungry, giving water to the thirsty, visiting the imprisoned. How can we not love the immigrant? Through Justice for Our Neighbors, we are able to love God's people as they risk their lives and welcome them into a country that doesn't always treat them well. Yes, we have undocumented immigrants living in our cities and towns, but I say to all that they are all invited. All have a place at the table. I love the image that Joe came up with. It's a never-ending table. Find your place there. It doesn't end. Last fall, as I was helping to start the new J-Fund clinics, I was also reading the Epistle of John. Our first reading this morning came from John's first epistle. Over and over again, I heard the message, love my people. Love the stranger living in your midst. Love the immigrant who has come to live among you. It seems we have two options. One either loves and knows God, or does not know love, or does not love and does not know God. John identifies the love that he's talking about as the same love that God showed to us by sending Jesus into the world. Listen to a couple of the verses again. Beloved, since God loved us so much, we also ought to love one another. No one has ever seen God. If we love one another, God lives in us, and his love is perfected in us. It's not that we loved God, but that God loved us. In verse 12, John talks about the invisibility of God. Since God is not visible, then we can only show our love for God by loving others. If that love stops with us, then it dies. God's love is intended to pass through us and on to others. The gospel lesson, according to the lectionary for today, is the one that Becky? No, Jennifer read. And it mirrors a similar story from the beginning of Luke's gospel. Did it sound familiar to you, that story? Mm-hmm. Jesus encounters the disciples at the shore of Galilee. They've been fishing all night without catching anything. Jesus, whom they don't really know in either passage, tells them to cast out again. This time they haul in a net full of fish. The difference in these two stories, this one in John and the one from Luke, is the placement in their perspective telling of the gospel. In Luke, it's at the beginning of the gospel, I think around chapter 4 or something, I'm not sure. And it immediately precedes the call of 4 of the disciples. In John's story, it's a story of resurrection, and it's after the resurrection, and it precedes Peter's forgiveness and reestablishment of Peter as the rock upon which the church will be built. John wants to communicate something unique to us in his placement of the story. And by adding the exchange between Jesus and Peter. That's not part of that story in Luke. Just a few short weeks ago, we came through the season of Lent. During that season, I participated in a study of the Apostle Peter. We were reminded that Peter denied Jesus 3 times. Remember back when you were in Lent, Peter denied Jesus 3 times. In today's gospel, we read that Peter told Jesus 3 times that he loved him. Author and United Methodist pastor Adam Hamilton doesn't think that the number 3 is a coincidence. He believes that it is directly related to the 3 denials that this passage, and that this passage reestablishes Peter as the rock upon which the church was built. If so, in one sense, the church is built upon a foundation of loving God's people. Yes, the church functions to pass faith from one generation to the next. And the church functions to show us how to love God's people. Now, I'll be the first to admit that the church hasn't always gotten it right. Amen. One of the things that surprised me when I was in seminary was that I really loved church history. And it surprised me because I hated history in high school. I didn't take any history. Oh, I took U.S. history because it was required for graduation. Right. That was the only history course I took. But in church history, I found the stories and people to refresh my faith and to give me hope for God's future church. Now, I also found the people and stories when the church did not get God's commandment to love God's people. These stories would question my faith until I came to see them as human failing rather than God failing. Amen. But there's no way to avoid the great commandment revealed throughout the gospel and spoken about so eloquently in today's scripture passages. Love my people. What does it mean to love God's people? Today, we focus on preparing a table as part of our call as community. Jesus crossed many divides by bringing folks to common tables. This love that crosses divides is what is meant by radical hospitality. What table practices in our own homes could bring us to Holy Communion with a new perspective? My husband and I share a home with our daughter, son-in-law, and 2 grandchildren. We have an upstairs apartment, and then there's the downstairs house where they live. We take turns preparing dinner for each other. We have 2 kitchens, one upstairs and one downstairs. And when one of us has prepared dinner, we tell our Google Home Mini to broadcast that dinner is ready. The other part of the family hears a bell ring on their Google Home Mini, and the Mini proclaims, "It's dinner time." When I invite you to communion, I invite all of you to communion, and all people to communion. As compared to other Christian denominations, we profess that in United Methodist churches, all are invited to have a place at the table. It's dinner time. Once I heard that we sing our faith into being, that we sing our hymns, we sing our songs, and that by singing, we actually become what we proclaim and what we sing. And I'm wondering if any of you are familiar with this anthem. Now, this one I'm not going to sing, okay? The other one was my kids' song, so it was easy to sing, but this one I'm not. But maybe some of you know this. For everyone born, a place at the table. For everyone born, clean water and bread. A shelter, a space, do you know it? No? It's not in your
We
head.
can look it up if it's there.
You can look it up, but it's not in your head.
Not here, I'm sure.
A shelter, a space, a safe place for growing. For everyone born, a star overhead. And God will delight when we are creators of justice and joy, compassion and peace. Yes, God will delight when we are creators of justice and joy. It kind of goes like this. For everyone born, a place at the table. For everyone born, clean water and bread. That's it. Okay. Let me share the other verses with you, because as I looked at this, I said, because they're harder. For woman and man, a place at the table, dividing the roles, dividing the shares, with wisdom and grace, dividing the power. For woman and man, a system that's fair. For young and for old, a place at the table, a voice to be heard, a part in the song, the hands of a child in hands that are wrinkled. For young and for old, the right to belong. And this was the hard verse. For just and unjust, a place at the table. Abuser abused, with need to forgive. In anger and hurt, a mindset of mercy. For just and unjust, a new way to live. Amen. I went through Holy Week just like you. You all did that, right? I was a reader for the Maundy Thursday service in the church that I go to with my family. And on Good Friday, this was my favorite part, well, maybe. I got to play the role of Judas. It was so good. I just loved it. I went to Easter services, the service at 9:30 led by our children and our youth choirs, and then a service at 11 o'clock led by the senior choir, and then we went to Easter dinner meeting up with Pat and Bob. So you'd think I was all Eastered out, right? I'd been to the requisite services, but something, or maybe that God thing, told me to go to one more. We share space at West Chelmsford United Methodist with the Brazilian congregation. So I went to one more service in the evening, and boy, did I hear a message. I heard from our Brazilian pastor preaching in Portuguese and then interpreted by a bilingual participation of that congregation. And I heard him say to me, claim your resurrection. You are resurrected with Christ. God has given you through Christ the power to love one another, even your enemies. We usually think about death and eternity when we start talking about our own resurrection, don't we? But I say to you that by following the way of Jesus, we find salvation. And we can enter into eternity today. Eternity begins right now in the moment that you accept Christ and the way of love. Love is our resurrection. Letting go of the walls that divide us is the way to new life. Deconstructing these walls leads to the God of love. And when we let God in, we let love change who we are. When we let God's love change us, then we too are resurrected alongside of Jesus Christ.